Those missiles were brilliant weapons. There's no question about it. And at the time, the Soviets had no way to really match them. And these missiles would have reached their targets probably as soon as the Soviets launched their own missiles against us. I had a personal relationship with, at the time, Colonel Bill Odom, who later on became the National Security Agency head as a 3-star under Reagan and Weinberger. And he had a major role to play in that. And when I came back from Germany in 1980, he was asking what was the attitude. And our goal at that time was to prevent Germany from being leveraged out of the NATO alliance. There were people in Germany that said, well, the solution to all of this is we just declare neutrality, we'll leave NATO. Of course, that had no chance of happening, but there were lots of people saying it at the time. And we wanted to prevent that because we didn't see any reason why the Soviets should have the opportunity to bully and intimidate Europeans. So we developed the Pershing. The Pershing 1, Pershing 2 missiles were brilliant. The Soviets looked at this, came to the table and said, all right, let's ban this entire category, which was a very, very dramatic step and a very good one. It's unfortunate that in 2019, President Trump, on the advice, I think, of some people who were very wrong-headed, abolished that treaty. Now, there's some good news here, and that is that the New START treaty, the New Strategic Arms Limitations Talks treaty, called New START, signed under the Obama administration, was actually extended when it went out of business in 2021, and it was extended for another 6 years. So we don't have to worry about that strategic level nuclear agreement until 2026 next year. But these, some people view arms control as an illusion. It doesn't make any difference what people agree to do. They never completely agree to it. But the truth is that both we and the Soviets, and then subsequently we and the Russians, have done a pretty good job of adhering to the various treaties. These treaties have saved us a lot of money, and I think they have also created a climate of what I would call of thinking people that are sensitive to the nuclear issue, want to avoid a nuclear collision at all costs. And I think that's the real problem right now. Something has happened, and I'm not sure what it is, both in the senior ranks of the American military as well as in Washington among politicians on the Hill and in the White House. They think that this is something they can play with, that this is something they can maneuver. In other words, the whole threat of nuclear war. The Russians take it very seriously. They are not insensitive to the consequences of blast heat and radiation and the loss of millions of lives. But for some reason, we in the West don't seem to think in those terms. And so the Russians are taking prudent measures. They're going to move weapons closer into White Russia. They've already done some of that, as well as areas in the Western Theater near St. Petersburg, north of that. And all of this is in response to things that we've been doing. And remember, we only very recently decided, for reasons that make no sense at all, to deploy tactical nuclear weapons to Great Britain, England, in fact. These are weapons designed to be delivered by aircraft against targets like St. Petersburg. So then you look at the Kaliningrad disaster, this general who was the co-architect of the disaster in the Afghan withdrawal, Donahue, a man who spent most of his military career in special ops, where I'm sure he was quite good. I just don't think special ops necessarily prepares you for strategic level thinking and discussions and decision making.
Just a couple of hours ago, I think, said that the Russian Foreign Ministry statement on the withdrawal of the moratorium on the deployment of medium and short-range missiles is the result of NATO countries' anti-Russian policy. This new reality, all our opponents will have to reckon with. Expect further steps. So what do you suspect that he may mean about these further steps?
I think his point is that the Russians are not bluffing. President Trump, as we both know, says one thing and 2 weeks later says another. And we know that he responded recently to the statements about that Medvedev made in a fit of anger. He was supposedly very angry. And he deployed 2 submarines to positions closer, presumably to Western Europe and Northern Europe than they had been otherwise deployed. First of all, you don't make decisions in a fit of anger. I mean, that's catastrophic. And then secondly, what Medvedev does is that he says things publicly that Putin absolutely refuses to say publicly. Remember, Putin's argument is, let's have private discussions. We can sit and talk about this in private. We don't discuss these matters in public, not because we want to keep everything hopelessly secret from the publics in Europe or the United States or Russia, but you can't make much progress when someone on the other side, and this is particularly true for President Trump, is exploiting the opportunity for some sort of political gain at home. And Putin wants nothing to do with that. So Medvedev, from time to time, steps out and he'll say something that Putin probably agrees with, but would never say himself. And I think that's what's happened. And Trump, President Trump, who is the head of state, as well as the political leader of the country, would bother responding is really the question on my mind. Respond to President Putin by all means, but don't respond to Medvedev. He may be in the inner circle, but let's not impute to him anything more than an attack dog role and understand what that is. I mean, the Russians don't like Lindsey Graham, but I can tell you that President Putin listens to what President Trump says, not to what Lindsey Graham says.
That seems to be the genesis of it for sure. But let me ask you, was his concern that he said, we don't want this to go in this other direction here because that wouldn't be good for us, was that borne out?
I think the INF treaty was a step in the right direction. It did produce openness. From our standpoint, it helped to eliminate a category of very dangerous weapons for all intents and purposes. That meant that both sides agreed, we're not going to use these. As soon as you decide not to use a particular category of nuclear weapons, that sends a hugely important signal to everyone. It means neither side wants to go to nuclear war. Very, very important. Now, the other thing that Reagan did mention, but was very important at the time, was to keep Germany inside the NATO alliance. And I can't stress that enough, because there were attitudes in Germany among many people that this is something they didn't want. They did not want nuclear weapons on German soil. And actually speaking, Eisenhower struggled with this in the 1950s. And he was approached about something very similar. Said, well, you have to put nuclear weapons into Germany. He says, I don't want to. And he said, by the way, if we put them there and the Soviets attack, they're in such overwhelming numbers, they'll overrun the nuclear weapons before we get a chance to use them. So he said, if we're going to have nuclear weapons, they should be at sea, or they could be delivered by the Air Force, or they should be on the periphery. In other words, perhaps Norway, Iceland, or North Africa, but not in Central East Europe. Ultimately, he reneged because people said, no, again, we can't get the Germans to stay in the alliance, and we don't promise to protect them. And that means we have to put nuclear weapons on the ground in Germany, because that then becomes a last-minute trigger for the use of strategic nuclear weapons if it looks like Germany could possibly be overrun. Now, that's the past. Here we are today. What are we doing right now? Well, as I said before, we've kept New START in existence. So on the strategic level, we're still abiding largely by the guidelines that define launchers and warheads for strategic nuclear weapons. That's a very good thing. I think it's a very bad thing that we've opened up this can of worms, though, with the INF. Because the missiles that we see now, you look at the Oreshnik, for instance, we can't stop it. We can't stop any of these hypersonic missiles. We can have hypersonic missiles launched from any number of different locations, and we can't stop them. We need to get that across. The most recent studies by NATO suggested that they could only defend perhaps 5% of NATO territory with air and missile defense. So who are we kidding?
Yeah.
You're talking about going to war. You've lost your mind. Today, I was sent a report from a source inside NATO about the transportation infrastructure and rail lines. It said, we're not prepared for a large-scale war. The transportation infrastructure is not sufficiently developed. We don't have control of it. We don't have any means of protecting it. So again, it's just craziness on steroids. I think it was James Madison in Federalist number 10 who said, we may not always have especially bright, capable, intelligent, and informed statesmen at the helm. In other words, he was talking about the White House. Therefore, we have the Supreme Court. Therefore, we have Congress and so forth. Well, we don't have very many enlightened people anywhere right now.
Right, yeah.
They're out of touch with reality. They don't get it. You know, every single exercise, and I certainly saw several of these. And yeah, you may have as well, but I certainly did, particularly when I was a full colonel and I monitored these things and I was able to read about them, particularly when I was at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. All the exercises and simulations that involved direct conflict with the Soviets, they all reached the same conclusion. Inevitably, if we go to war with these people, we're going to have a nuclear exchange. It's very simple. We can't field enough conventional forces. You know, we started back in the 1960s. We developed this thing called flexible response. We were trying to find any way we could to sort of keep the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons very, very high. But nevertheless, in all of these, we inevitably went to the use of a nuclear weapon. Then the other conclusion was, well, if we do this, we can't control escalation. Whereas once you use a nuclear weapon, it's over. And then finally, General Powell in the early 1990s, when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he said, don't come in here and tell me we could drop a tactical nuke on somebody and the Russians are not, or the Soviets are not going to say, you know, that's a nuke. In other words, oh, no, don't worry about that. That's a low-yield nuclear weapon. That's not going to lead to any major country. He says that's just crazy. That's complete nonsense. So the conclusion that everybody reached, I don't want to say everybody because there are always outliers, but the majority of senior military leaders, and I would argue even on the Hill, people like Sam Nunn and others had reached the conclusion that you wanted to avoid war with the Soviets at all cost. Well, all of a sudden now you've got a president who seems to be going out of his way to provoke the Russians. And he now has as one of his spokesmen a 4-star general who is threatening Russian national sovereign territory around Kaliningrad, this little enclave of East Prussia that FDR gave Stalin at the end of the war, or in the spring of 1945. That's unfortunate. I don't think FDR should have done that, but then again, there are a lot of things that FDR should not have done, but it's irrelevant now. It's whatever.
Yeah, it is.
That's now Russian national territory. If you attack it, everything is fair game. You're going to be at war with the Russian state. Now, this is nuts. This is insane. No sitting general officer should announce to the world any intentions, right, or confirm. This is even more important if you're a Russian intelligence officer. This is a bonanza because he's just confirmed that these aren't just intentions. We have plans.
Plans, yeah.
Insane. You know what? They're out of touch with reality. You know, you don't want to go down this road for the reasons I just answered. We've been avoiding this stuff for what, 60 years?
Right.
All of a sudden now it's okay. Have these people lost their minds? I don't know, but it's back to Madison. We will not always have enlightened men at the helm of state.
We got out.
Well, let's go back to what the last Russian said or talked about, which is the air and missile defense installation in Romania. Remember, this is something that we established there ostensibly for the purpose of protecting Europe from Iranian ballistic missiles. Now, let's stop and consider that for a minute. Here's Iran, and this is what year, 2019?
Right.
And has never expressed any interest in or any intention under any circumstances to attack anyone in the world with anything except Israel in response to an attack. Now, that I didn't even mention ballistic missiles, but we put this thing into Romania and said that with the radars and the anti-missile missiles, these things pose no threat to Russia. This was entirely focused on Iran. Well, I'm sure the Russians doubled over in laughter. Why would they ever believe such a thing? When I was on active duty, I suggested that in order to allay Russian fears, which I quickly found out nobody gave a damn about, was to invite the Russians to inspect the facility to satisfy themselves that this facility was, in fact, not aimed at them. So, well, that's ridiculous, Macgregor. You've lost your mind. We're never going to do such a thing. Well, that's what you do if you don't want a war.
War, yeah.
You know, I mean, I've talked about this before, and it's never a guarantee that it will work. But for decades, you had a personal adjutant we would say aide de camp, assigned to the German emperor, one assigned to the Russian emperor, and one assigned to the emperor in Vienna in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Each one represented an emperor from the other camp. And this was designed to ensure that personal communications between the three could occur regardless of the circumstances, conditions, crises, conflicts, whatever. That ultimately falls apart in 1914. Actually, it fell apart a little bit before then, but it was a good idea. There is no reason why we should not have a system between Beijing, Moscow, and the United States to deal routinely all the time with these matters. We should have liaison officers here from those two nations, and ours should be where they are. The whole thing is to allay fear. In other words, to build confidence, reassure that there is no intention to strike anybody. Now, again, somebody will say, well, Macgregor, you've lost your mind. You know, we deter these people because they don't know what we'll do. Very, very dangerous position to take with nuclear weapons. It's very easy to misinterpret any kind of action we may take any number of different places as evidence for an imminent strike. And
Right.
The same thing is true today for us. We don't know enough about Russia. We used to know a great deal more. We don't know very much right now. And I think the Russians don't really understand early warning. And I think Ted Postal has spoken to you about this, may have spoken to others, that their early warning system leaves much to be desired. We ought to be interested in those things. Instead, we are actively provoking, offending, insulting, and attacking people on every conceivable level. And people need to understand that sanctions are not harmless, that what they are meant to do damage. And most people, most of the time in the world, regard the use of economic sanctions as an act of war. We need to get out of that business.
And you know, some of these concerns that are playing out, some of which you just mentioned, were listed in 2019 by a European Federica Mogherini, who was worried about the development in the negative direction.
We are, and I think it's gotten worse because this is really about Trump, who thinks he's leading a crusade against BRICS. He's trying to bash, bully, intimidate anyone who does business with Russia. He's tried to do that to China. It's all failed miserably. None of it is going to change anything. Fighting BRICS is a losing battle at this stage. If anything, BRICS is a consequence of our behavior in the past. People are just really tired of being bullied by us through the IMF, the World Bank, the SWIFT system. This is what de-dollarization is all about. And I think that President Trump and his advisors undoubtedly have told him this, that you can use the strategic military dimension as a way to leverage our power against BRICS. And of course, you have the other problem is the same people that want us to go to war in the Middle East all the time are the same people that are pushing war against Russia, even though they keep insisting, well, we're not talking about a direct confrontation. Well, if you're not talking about a direct confrontation, you certainly sound like it. And they hate Russia. They hate it because it's the primary fortress holding out against globalism. And President Trump, who we thought we elected because he was not a globalist, seems to have taken on the mantle of leadership for globalism. So destroy Russia, destroy Orthodox Christianity, destroy the population, destroy its people, strip it of resources, on and on and on. It's just insane. It's crazy. It's all failed. There's no chance that it's going to happen anytime soon. But nevertheless, he's leading this now. I don't even think he understands what he's leading. This is not something in the interest of the American people or the United States. Ukraine, heavily involved in what I would call the false flag, dirty tricks agenda. We know that they provided the false flags in Syria that led President Trump to launch missiles into the desert in Syria. This is back during his first term. We know that the SAS working with MI6 has been very effective in little raids that designed to embarrass the Russians, damage ships sitting in harbor, hit isolated radars or missile sites, or simply terrorize the Russian population by killing Russian civilians. So I wouldn't be surprised. But what I think is interesting is the following. First of all, the British are talking about what amounts to a sea embargo. In other words, using American and allied naval power, primarily U.S. naval power, to intercept and halt the transport of oil over the sea, oil that's Russian, in origin, presumably. That's very interesting to me because, the British, this is their thinking. Britain, like us, is historically a maritime power. The problem with that is I don't think it would make much difference anymore. Oh, it'll hurt a little bit if we were to do it. But you have this thing called the One Belt, One Road, and we've already seen the trains coming from China all the way to Iran now. We're going to see more of this rail and road infrastructure open up, with the result that they'll be able to travel over the space of a few days what normally would take weeks at sea. So I don't think I don't think you can expect the level of success from this that is implied. But here's something else. You start stopping other people's ships carrying oil that ostensibly or reputedly comes from Russia, you're going to be at war again. You're going to be not just at war with Russia, with any number of different countries. I mean, this makes a mockery of our supposed interest in freedom of navigation. It's the exact opposite. We're freedom of navigation for us and nobody else.
Anyone want to risk a nuclear escalation instead of just bringing this to an end?
I hope. I can't prove it, but I hope that more sober minds will prevail, certainly in the Department of Defense, and make it very clear that the notion of escalating to the level of nuclear conflict is simply off the table, that there's no chance for that to have any good outcome. And I would hope that somebody would also urge the president, at least through his advisors, to reconsider the wisdom of mentioning it, not overreacting. Too many people emote. This is particularly true in Washington and particularly true for President Trump. This is not the time to emote. Now, that's the first thing. Second thing is all of this business, this equipment that's being promised, in some cases, it doesn't even exist. When you start looking at Patriot batteries and radars and missiles, that's not even around. I mean, what are you going to ship over there? And even if you shipped what was promised by President Trump, somebody said to me from Raytheon, we're looking at 15 minutes of air-to-air and missile defense. In other words, there's not enough missiles to make a damn difference. And I think that's something that hasn't sunk in. I think the president should be briefed in great detail on this and understand that he can promise the sun, maybe get the moon, and probably only long after Ukraine has fallen apart. Now, this morning, there was a published statement allegedly drawn from the Russian general staff that Ukraine has at the outside 3 months left, 90 days. And that within those 90 days, everything will collapse. Now, the reason was that first we've got battalions of boys and old men. I mean, I can just see guys like me at my age running around with rifles out there. Good luck. Mm-hmm. And the same thing is true with boys, kids that are 15, 14, 15, 16. This is absurd. It's ridiculous. So this regime is dying. There's no question about it. And long before MI6 gets to install Zelensky as their chosen successor to Zelensky, this thing is going to be over. So the question is, what do you do if you're sitting in the White House? Well, President Trump is very loath to stand up publicly and say, well, I guess I was wrong. I couldn't end this in 24 hours. Oh, I guess I was wrong. I can't bring these people to the peace table. I guess I was wrong. That's not going to happen. You're going to hear a lot of stupid crap about, well, President Trump tried his best, but President Putin lied to him. Well, that's all nonsense. That's just crap. Listen to what President Putin says over and over and over again. It has not changed over the last 36 months, frankly. And he's taken steps periodically to tell them exactly what the conditions are. Finally, there's this. What did we do after the Vietnam debacle? We stopped talking about it. Did you ever hear anybody stand up and say, well, I was right, but, things didn't work out quite that way. So, no, nobody does that. Generals don't stand up and say, I was wrong. Everything I predicted never happened. My assessments were wrong. You could start with General Paul Harkins back in 1963, go all the way through up till Fred Wyand at the end as the commander in Vietnam. Nobody does that. And I think what will happen is what we recommended, at least I recommended from the very beginning. President Trump, you want this to stop? We agree. Cease the delivery of all military aid immediately. Arrange for the delivery of humanitarian assistance to the Ukrainians that need it and medical care and so forth through a third country. Get everyone who is an American citizen, whether they're in or out of uniform, whether they're intelligence or conventional military, it doesn't make any difference. All need to get out of Ukraine now. Do those things, and the Russians will then take you seriously because they'll recognize, oh, the Americans have finally figured it out. We don't have any vital strategic interest in Ukraine. We never have. I mean, that's the simple truth. We wish everybody well, but we're not interested. This is an artificially created war. We created it with the help of our British friends and others in NATO. It needs to end. Only we can end it quickly. But you don't end it by presiding at some peace talk where everybody stands next to you and smiles and says, we love you, President Trump. You're such a great man. That's not going to happen. So just cut bait. Get out. You would think a businessman who has seen more than a few bad investments over many years would know when up. That's it. We're going to take the loss and move on. We can't. Let's not feed this loss anymore.
Right. Exactly.
Be done with it. That's what he needs to do. I think eventually that's what we will do, because if you go down the road that's being charted by this General Donahue, you're going to pause and point out. And I think Scott Ritter and Larry Johnson and others have done this, that the dead hand is simply a mechanism that ensures that if the Russians are a victim of first strike, and regardless of how much damage the first strike does, including kill them in great numbers, the dead hand is simply a mechanism that ensures that the Russians strike back with everything they've got. That's about it. So it's really a defensive mechanism. It's not an offensive one. So it's important to keep that in mind. The second thing, as we've said before, this is Medvedev. This is not Putin. President Trump should respond to other heads of state, not to people that are not heads of state, frankly. They don't matter. What matters is what the head of state says, the man who's actually in control. Now, the last bit of this is disturbing because Trump's personality is easily manipulated by people who are saying, well, if you do this, boss, you're going to be tough. And that's what Americans want. They want a tough guy out there to lay down the law and make it clear what we're not going to do and what they have to do. A lot of people in my generation that were involved in the Vietnam War, unfortunately, are very easily seduced by this. More than one person who was in Vietnam has said to me on several occasions, we got to be tough with these people. They're bad. We know them. We dealt with them before. Come on, this is not the Cold War. These people are not communists. They're Russians. And while there is always overlap, because underlying culture and national identity, ethnicity, religion, language, all those things always assert themselves and are always more important than any ideology. In this particular case, what they're being accused of and what is real are not the same thing, as you know, and as you pointed out. But this kind of thing very much appeals to the boomer generation, of which I'm a member. And I think Jack Keane exemplifies this. It's all about bullying somebody and being tough. Well, not really. This is about avoiding nuclear war, period, at all costs. It's about identifying real strategic interests, not imaginary interests. There is no interest on our part in what happens in eastern Ukraine, never has been. You could make an argument that we should have made it clear from the very beginning that at least the Dnieper River should be respected as a demarcation line beyond which we recommend the Russians not move. That could have been done early on, and that would have made sense. And I think the Russians feel that way in any case, because if they had wanted to cross that river, they could have done that much earlier than has happened. I mean, they just have refused to cross that river because they don't want Ukraine. They've never been interested in ruling Ukrainians. Anybody who knows the history knows the Western Ukrainians, knows the Poles, knows the Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, The Russians don't want to be bothered with those people. They're not fools. What they're trying to do is secure their country, and they want people to respect their legitimate national security interests. So this has nothing to do with being strong or bullying anybody. But I think President Trump is receptive to that message. It's not a good message. He shouldn't be. And again, it goes back to my earlier comment. Sometimes we won't have enlightened men at the helm, as pointed out by James Madison. So it's important that we have people in uniform, as well as people who are civilian appointees and elected to office, that will exercise a little more, let us say, balanced common sense.
Well, we can certainly hope that that occurs at some point, or even just self-interest. If it gets to any kind of critical point, will rule the day and prevent stupidity that could lead to catastrophic outcomes for our country.
And there's something else. There's one thing to also point out that everybody misses. We always have missile boats and attack subs at sea. That's probably arguably the most important strategic instrument at our disposal in terms of national defense. That's why I think our submarine fleet is too small and needs to be much larger and more capable.
Yeah.
Always have, and felt that should be our top priority. But we've always had those ships out there, those boats, rather. And those boats can attack Russia or anybody else very quickly from any number of locations. The second thing is the Russians have boats like that. And they too are off our shores. Who are we kidding? We need to wake up and understand that this is a very dangerous set of circumstances. Someone brought to my attention, I think it was 2010 or 2011, the people in Nome, Alaska were isolated. It had been a terrible ice storm, massive snows, worse than what you would normally expect. And we couldn't get any fuel oil to them. And so the Coast Guard finally said, listen, the only people that can get fuel to these people quickly are the Russians. And we asked the Russians to help. And they did. They sent a tanker in behind a Coast Guard icebreaker. And we were lucky to have that icebreaker because at the time, there were other icebreakers and they were all out of commission. Today, the Russians have the largest fleet of icebreakers in the world.
All right.
But my point is, we asked for help and assistance, and they gave it quickly and unhesitatingly, and they didn't gouge us on the price of the oil, which I can't emphasize enough. We got to get past this artificial conflict that has been created in Ukraine.
Agreed. Couldn't agree with you more.
How to do that, except the president has got to stand up and be courageous and say, this needs to end. I'm ending it. This is what I'm doing. We're getting out. But that's his warning. I don't think you need to say too much beyond that. However, Mr. Netanyahu and his country is in a very difficult position. Now, what is that position? The two of them, both he and his country, are facing desperation. He has launched a number of different attacks in different directions at different people. Ships, weapons from Japan. In other words, they've moved away from us. And I think we're going to see more of that in the future. The Japanese have told us, frankly, to fly a kite. They're going to buy as much oil and gas as they want from Russia. They could care less. The Chinese, the same thing. I think this BRICS thing is going to accelerate. I think you're going to have more and more and more members saddle up and join. It makes sense to do so. Otherwise, you are in a debt trap created for you by the United States government and the dollar. So I think all of this is going to backfire. Again, what do you do if you're president of the United States? You're interested in doing what's in the interest of the American people. Is it in our interest to be co-conspirators in the mass murder or expulsion of millions of people from Gaza? Does this help us and assist us in any way in the region? Does it assist us globally? I don't think it does. You can ask the same question about how does it help us to stay engaged in eastern Ukraine and cause battalions of boys and old men at gunpoint to be herded into Russian machine gun, artillery, and rocket fire. I don't think it does. But, I hold the minority opinion right now, and this is, after all, the Israel First administration. And the European Union are both going to go out of business. It's a question of when, not if. There is tremendous discontent in Europe with the European Union that has tried to make itself into an international governing body and subjugate all of Europe to its will. That's dead. Everybody's sick to death of it. Most people in most cases are sympathetic to President Orban in Hungary and Fico in Slovakia. I think you're going to see more people like that emerge. The leadership in Croatia is much more sober-minded, has refused to have anything to do with the stupidity in Ukraine. I think Slovenia is not far behind, but they're smaller and a little less courageous as a result. I understand there's there are reservations. So I think the EU thing is going to collapse. It's coming. Italy is already on the edge of dumping it. The Greeks are. So that's going to go away. NATO, what is NATO? Where is the great NATO army that's prepared to arm up, saddle up, and march east? I don't see it. I think anybody who imagines that is, smoking something, and it's not legal. So I think these institutions have outlived their utility and their necessity. So I guess what you'll see is a sort of a gradual abandonment of NATO and this Ukraine madness that starts in Poland and Slovakia and Hungary and Romania and moves west.